And for part three of today's geopolitics. Hopefully, you're taking breaks in between all of these and just go get something to eat, go get some fresh air, take the dog for a walk, help your mom with the dishes, and do something besides just sit on the couch and eat. I'm trying to. So anyway, geopolitical forces influencing today's map. So what we want to do now is kind of look at the current state of geopolitics. And we're going to go through these topics. Colonialism, what's the legacy of that? Yes, it's true that the European powers are not still in charge of most of the countries on the African continent, but what do they leave behind? How does that impact how those people live and interact now? We'll talk about civil wars and how that has impacted politics in different countries. Rwanda is a great example, and that's part of the legacy of colonialism, to be honest. And so is the Cold War. So we're going to look a little bit at the Cold War. I know that you've done it in world history, and some of you are already pretty well versed in the Cold War and Cold War politics. So we also want to talk about newly independent states. Yugoslavia, I know you haven't been alive at a time that Yugoslavia was actually a country. But I saw it break apart. I saw what was going on there. And I actually, worked with some people who were refugees having left there because of that civil war and the ethnic cleansing that was happening. And so it's really worth it to watch that video that I suggested for you, the 30 for 30 on ESPN. And it's really good. It's about two NBA basketball players from Yugoslavia who were, as close as brothers. And then those ethnic differences, when they came to a political head in Europe, they actually really impacted their friendship. So that's a good one to watch. All right, let's see. Okay, so let's talk about decolonization. I mean, the word suggests, this is when colonizing powers, imperial powers, actually leave from a country and leave it to be newly independent. So the Asian and African colonial subjects, the colonists, were inspired by nationalist movements and resisted European rule. So what happened, it was almost like this contagious diffusion where seeing one group of people, one nation of people throw off the imperial yoke of their country, that inspired them to do the same. And you start to see it almost like a domino effect Africa and in Asia. So then, after another example would be in 1945, after World War II, you have NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is a military alliance whose purpose was to protect against any aggression by the Soviet Union after World War II. But they really did support self-determination. They supported this idea of nation states becoming independent. The Berlin Conference was in 1884, 1885. By 1984, 1985, almost all of the territories that Europe had, these European countries, whether it's Netherlands, Belgium, France, England, whatever, most of them became politically independent. Now, there is going to be a difference here between political independence and economic independence. So what happened with these countries is that they were able to get political independence, which means, okay, we are no longer subjects of the Queen. We are no longer British subjects. But the problem was it left this economic vacuum in these newly established, newly independent states, right? So who do they depend on they have to rebuild their economy. So if they're looking at, let's say that diamond mines were a huge economic activity by the English in that state. Well, they were mining diamonds. Where were they shipping them? The railroads all led to the coasts. The railroads all led to wherever the English could export it, to take those assets off the continent and sell on the global market. So it wasn't benefiting the African continent at all. Same is true if you go northern on the African continent, where you see places like Goodyear. Rubber was a huge industry, and they really depended on it for any economic activity at all. The problem was these companies, these corporations, were not African corporations. They were English corporations, or they were American corporations, or they were French corporations, or they were German or Belgian. And so while they're not tied politically anymore, they are still very dependent to these transnational corporations for any economic activity or any economic growth that they're going to have. And that goes, that's not just Africa. If you look at, for instance, bananas, look at Latin America, and look at the history of Chiquita banana or Dole fruits in Latin America, and it's astonishing. So then we also have a number of civil wars. Remember, we don't say third world countries, we say developing or less developed. So there's going to be some growing pains. Remember, these areas that are becoming independent in Africa, especially, who's going to be in charge? All of these colonial territories now become their own states. And don't forget those little red lines of all those different nations that are included, and the diversity and the history that exists between and among these people. Great example will be Rwanda. When the British left, there was one tribal group that I think I said the British, I meant the Belgians, I'm sorry. When the Belgians left, there was one group that they favored over the other group. There are two major ethnic groups in Rwanda. They favored one over the other, and so gave all those people positions of power and wealth and stuff. So when they left, the group that didn't get all that, they went after that other ethnic group. And that created this huge civil war, huge ethnic cleansing, huge refugee crisis. Watch Hotel Rwanda, or any documentary. I always recommend the documentary instead. And so this is what you have when you have a multi-nation state, which is what these territories became. So the colonies gained independence, but they were only political constructs, which meant that, yes, they were states, but they weren't really nation states, because the nations were split apart or forced to live together as residents of the same state, thereby becoming the same nationality, not to be confused with the word nation. It all gets very, very muddled up. You have to really take time to make sure you can keep it straight. And here's my example from Rwanda in 1994. Rwanda gained its independence from Belgium. There was a conflict between the Hutus and the Tutsis. Okay. And what's interesting here is that the way the Belgians chose which group they were going to favor was the ones that were taller, they were lighter skinned, they had thinner lips and thinner noses. And so they favored that group over the other. And then that's what led to this division after the Belgians left. You're talking about like around 1 million people that were chopped up by machetes in their beds. I mean, it was horrific. It was horrible. Okay. I don't know what happened to my slide here. Not sure why there was so much spacing there. That's okay. So Rwanda is one example of the problems that occur in a multinational state, one state, more than one nation. Okay. Remember that one of the problems with a multi-nation state is that one group does try to dominate. Now let's kind of turn the page to Kurdistan. Look at the Kurds. They are a stateless nation. So Stan, S-T-A-N, actually means the people of. Okay. So when you see the Afghanistan, these are people who are Afghans. You see Turkmenistan, these are people who are Turks. You see Uzbekistan, these are people who are Uzbeks. S-T-A-N means people who are, people of. So you have these Kurds, and this whole area that they occupy They call it Kurdistan, even though it does span territory over many different states. And there's your list. Okay. And you're not talking about like 3 dozen people. You're talking about 25 and between 25 and 30 million people. This is a lot of people. And there you see in the yellow, you see Kurdistan. You see where these Kurds live. And you see that for the most part, they do occupy a significant amount of territory just themselves. I mean, yes, there's more than one of them, but still they're not so dispersed, right? They're concentrated into an area that you could call a nation. Now let's move into the Cold War, which you're probably, again, you're already familiar with. The Cold War started at the end of World War II, around 1995. It ended between 1989 and 1991. 1989 is when the Berlin Wall came down. So I want to introduce you to the term proxy war. Proxy wars. So you have two sides in the Cold War. You have the United States and you have the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the Soviet Union. And so basically everybody in the world had to choose a side. And each of these sides wanted to make sure that they were the ones being chosen. And so whenever there was a conflict, both sides would kind of go into it and fight against each other, but not really. So really, is it the North Vietnamese fighting the South Vietnamese? Or is it really the Soviet Union forces versus the American forces? And that's what we mean by proxy wars. Like the subject of the war isn't really the subject of the war. It's really more about global domination and having more people or more states under your ideology. So you see that in Korea, you see it in Vietnam, you saw it in Afghanistan. The front line for the Cold War would be Europe, where you can see a great division, a very neat division down Eastern Europe. We call that the Iron Curtain. And on the eastern side of the Iron Curtain are countries that we now know of as Ukraine, Slovakia, Romania, places like that. And it went all the way up through Germany. And of course, the East Germany and Poland were part of that Eastern bloc. So, and those were satellite states for the Soviet Union. So basically, they were part of the Union. They were considered part of their sphere of influence, is what we want to call it. So you see that Germany is split up into West Germany and East Germany. Interestingly, if you remember, Berlin is the capital of Germany, was then as well. Berlin is located right smack in the middle of what was East Germany. So in the middle of East Germany, if you can imagine it, you have this city that is also divided east and west. So it didn't sit on the boundary between East and West Germany. Berlin itself was divided into East and West, even though it was like this little bubble in the middle of East Germany. So when the Soviet Union fell, when the end of the Cold War came, you started to see these countries become independent. And they're still struggling economically because now they're not part of that I don't want to call it an empire, but they're not protected by that Soviet Union mentality. So it splits back into, now you have Russia. Then you have the satellite states, Romania, Moldova, Czech Republic, Slovakia, these areas that are now independent states. So, one great example, of course, this is my favorite, Czechoslovakia. It was a state since the end of World War One. But in 1993, just after it became independent from the Soviet Union, the Czech Republic became independent from Slovakia. It was really more Slovakia that wanted to be free of the Czech Republic. We call it the Velvet Divorce because it wasn't some kind of civil war or violent secession. They just split apart. They just decided that's what they were going to do. And just a little trivia there. In English, the Czech Republic is actually Czechia. although hardly anybody uses it. And if you call it Czechia, most people won't know what you're talking about. All right, here is what used to be Yugoslavia. And notice you've got in the middle Bosnia and Herzegovina, Croatia, Slovenia. Over to the east, you have Serbia, okay? And adjacent to that is Macedonia. This was all one country of Yugoslavia. All these are now nation states, okay? Um, the that was the cause of Yugoslavia breaking apart, was this ethnic conflict between Serbs and Muslims mostly, and it was a huge ethnic cleansing campaign that went on. If you notice down in the bottom, the southern part of Serbia, you see Kosovo. It's called an autonomous province. They consider themselves their own state, but they have not fulfilled all the requirements yet to be recognized as a state by the Soviet Union. And same is true up on the northern part, except that I can't pronounce that one. So when they become a state, when they fulfill all the requirements for the UN to recognize them, chances are that they will become what we would call a sovereign independent state itself. And here is the details. And I want to introduce you to another term called balkanization. What's interesting here is that I'm going to switch back real quick. This region of the world is referred to as the Balkans. It's always been the Balkans. And so when this country split apart, when Yugoslavia split apart and broke up, that took on the name balkanization. And so you can use that term for other countries, other states besides just the former Yugoslavia, but that's where the term originated. The fragmentation of a state or region into smaller units. And often they're not good friends. Okay. So there you have your definitions, or your details for the former Yugoslavia. This is, what is that? Well, let's just move on. There's the Czech Republic right in the middle with Slovakia next to it. Okay. Bear with me. Bear with me. Okay, so I want to show you the European Union as it sits now. And then I want to show you the refugee crisis that we're having, that's coming from, not we're having, they're having, that's coming from the direction of Turkey down there in the southeast. You notice with all of this fragmentation, all of this balkanization, all of these conflicts that are going on, it's easy for us just to say, oh, that's happening over there. That doesn't impact anybody else. But here you have refugee flows. Look at all of these people being displaced because of the conflicts from where they are. The ethnic conflicts, the nationalism is creating these refugees. We talked a lot about this in migration in Unit 2 when we talked about Syria, forced migration, and you did a lot with refugees. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this. Okay. During the Cold War, there was a huge goal, which was how do I say, maintaining the balance of power. This was the whole reason for the arms race. This was the whole reason for these proxy wars, is that neither side, not the US nor the USSR, wanted the other side to have more countries in alliance than they had. Okay. So you start to see this change when the Soviet Union falls. It changes that balance of power because now the Soviet Union doesn't have control over all those former satellite states, right? So NATO and the European Union were both formed and they grew. And you started to see a lot of these former Soviet satellite states, let's say Hungary, joining NATO. And what was the entire purpose of NATO to begin with? To protect from the aggression of the Soviets. And so you really see them switching sides now. Now what you're starting to see, though, also, if you pay attention to current events at all, and I know right now there's just way too much to pay attention to, and I wouldn't blame you if you just put your head under a pillow and ignored it all. But you start to see some Russian aggression down toward the Ukrainian region, where they have tried to take over Georgia, Chechnya. They've taken over the Crimean Peninsula. And if you look at a map, then you will see why. So look at Russia here and look at the land mass of Russia and tell me how easy it would be for them to interact globally in terms of shipping, let's say. I mean, you could go through Siberia. You could take a train all the way across Siberia and get over there into Eastern Asia. You go north. The problem is you have ice, you have snow. This is not okay. This is not ideal for exporting. Look how far east Moscow is from those areas. And in order to get anywhere, they have to go through other countries, which means they have to maintain good relations with these other countries in order to have access to those ports and sea routes. Now look at the Ukrainian region. Look at the Strait of Bosphorus, okay? That's right there with Turkey and Greece, okay? This in order to, if you can get through the Strait of Bosphorus near Istanbul, then you can get into the Black Sea, the Mediterranean Sea, either way. And look at what is right there north of the Black Sea that would give Russia access to the Strait of Bosphorus. It would be that entire Crimean Peninsula, which is south of Ukraine. You can see right there, it's that little part that's bulging out into the Black Sea. And you can see easily why Russia wants to solidify holds on Chechnya, Georgia, parts of Ukraine. In Ukraine, what they're using as justification is that there are a lot of people in Crimea who are ethnic Russian. And so they're saying that they're doing this. And, we talked about earlier about people of the same nation wanting to come together and be a state. So that's what they're using for their justification there. And that's it. That's our current events for today. Look into that. Just take a few minutes if you want to. And I will try to be back tomorrow. I think this is probably enough to last you a couple days, but I'm doing the best I can. And let me know if you have any questions at all. And I will see you later. Take care. Bye-bye.